that President Trump engaged in criminal activity.
What happened today in Washington, inside the House Judiciary Committee, was not an ordinary hearing. It was a direct confrontation. On one side, Special Counsel Jack Smith. On the other, Donald Trump's MAGA Republicans. A hearing that Jim Jordan and his allies clearly intended to turn into a political attack slowly became something else entirely. It became a record that Donald Trump did not want created. Jack Smith did not come in shouting. He did not come in performing. He did not come in campaigning. He came in measured, controlled, focused, and that calm, deliberate presence made MAGA Republicans visibly uncomfortable because Jack Smith is not a pundit. He is not an activist. He is the prosecutor who brought the most serious criminal charges ever filed against a former president of the United States.
President Trump was charged because the evidence established that he willfully broke the law, the very laws he took an oath to uphold.
Today, Jack Smith was not there to defend himself. He was there to explain the system, and every attempt to distract, deflect, or provoke him only made one thing clearer. This hearing was never about oversight. It was about intimidation, and intimidation failed. At the very beginning of the hearing, Jack Smith made something unmistakably clear. The decisions he made in his investigation were not political. They were legal. Jack Smith stated plainly that the charges brought against Donald Trump were based on evidence, not ideology, not party affiliation, not public pressure, evidence.
Thank you for the opportunity to discuss my work as special counsel. I love my country and believe deeply in the core principles.
He explained that if the same conduct had been committed by a Democrat, the outcome would have been identical. Because prosecutors do not work for parties. They work for the law. Jack Smith addressed a question that MAGA Republicans repeatedly try to avoid. Why bring these charges at all? His answer was direct. The evidence demanded it. He explained that during the investigation, his office uncovered proof that met the highest legal standard, proof that could not be ignored without abandoning the role of a prosecutor entirely. Jack Smith emphasized that failing to act under those circumstances would not have been restraint. It would have been negligence. He also addressed the accusation that he was acting under orders from the Biden administration. Jack Smith rejected that claim completely. He stated that Attorney General Merrick Garland did not pressure him. President Joe Biden did not direct him. No one in the administration interfered with his decisions. The responsibility was his, and so was the accountability. This moment mattered because it stripped away one of the central MAGA talking points. There was no secret command, no political marching order, just a prosecutor doing exactly what the law requires when evidence of serious crimes exists. Jack Smith explained that prosecutors are not judged by how comfortable their decisions make people feel. They are judged by whether they follow the facts and apply the law evenly. And in this case, the facts led directly to Donald Trump. As Jack Smith continued, the room shifted. This was no longer a partisan argument. It was a question of integrity. If a former president can avoid accountability simply because of his status, then the justice system itself ceases to function. Jack Smith made clear that this was never a choice for him. Once the evidence was established, the obligation was unavoidable. And that obligation did not disappear because the defendant was powerful. As the hearing continued, the focus shifted to one of the most serious matters at the center of Jack Smith's investigation, the handling of classified documents after Donald Trump left office. Jack Smith made clear that this case was never about a paperwork mistake. It was about intent, it was about refusal, and it was about obstruction. According to Jack Smith, after losing the 2020 election, Donald Trump did not simply contest the results. He rejected them. And after leaving the White House, that same pattern continued. Instead of returning classified materials that belonged to the United States government, Trump retained them illegally. Jack Smith explained that these were not ceremonial documents. They were highly sensitive national security materials, documents that, by law, were required to be secured and returned. What made this case even more alarming was not just possession, but location. Jack Smith stated that classified materials were stored inside Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago property, not in a secure facility, not in a protected vault, but in spaces accessible to others. A ballroom, a bathroom, areas with no authorization to house classified information. This was not accidental, and it was not brief. Jack Smith explained that when efforts were made to retrieve those documents, Donald Trump did not cooperate. Instead, according to the investigation, he repeatedly attempted to obstruct the process. He resisted requests. He delayed compliance. He concealed materials. This was not a misunderstanding, it was a pattern. During the hearing, Jack Smith was limited in how much detail he could publicly discuss about the Mar-a-Lago case. Court orders prevented the release of specific sealed information. But even within those constraints, the core message was unmistakable. The conduct involved went far beyond negligence. It involved deliberate actions to retain and hide government property. Then came the subject that MAGA Republicans attempted to minimize: threats. Jack Smith was asked about Donald Trump's public statements directed at him personally, statements made repeatedly, statements broadcast to millions. Trump had publicly suggested that Jack Smith should be investigated, imprisoned, disgraced. He had used inflammatory language to portray the prosecutor as an enemy. Jack Smith did not respond emotionally. He did not escalate. He described the statements for what they were: attempts at intimidation. He explained that such language was not only aimed at him, it was a warning to others, a message that anyone who enforces the law against Donald Trump would be targeted. Jack Smith made one thing clear: the intimidation did not work. He stated calmly that he would not be deterred, not by rhetoric, not by insults, not by threats. The investigation followed department policy. It followed evidence, and it followed the law. Nothing else mattered. This moment in the hearing was significant because it exposed a pattern that extended far beyond this case. When accountability appears, Donald Trump attacks the process. When scrutiny intensifies, he targets individuals. And when legal pressure mounts, he escalates rhetoric instead of addressing facts. Jack Smith did not speculate. He did not dramatize. He simply stated that the evidence established serious criminal conduct, and pretending otherwise would not change reality. The calmness of that response stood in sharp contrast to the hostility coming from the other side. By this point, it was becoming clear that this hearing was not producing the outcome MAGA Republicans expected. Instead of undermining Jack Smith, they had amplified the seriousness of the allegations. They had highlighted the strength of the investigation, and they had unintentionally reinforced why these cases exist at all. As Part 3 came to a close, one reality stood out. This was not about personal conflict. This was about accountability. And no amount of pressure had changed the foundation of the case against Donald Trump. As the hearing moved forward, the discussion returned to January 6th, a date that MAGA Republicans have spent years trying to rewrite. Jack Smith did not engage in revision. He focused on consequences. Jack Smith addressed the issue of accountability for those involved in the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. He explained that many of the individuals convicted were not minor offenders. They were people who assaulted law enforcement officers, people who used violence to obstruct a constitutional process, people who were found guilty after trials. Jack Smith stated plainly that judges across the country had determined these individuals posed a danger to their communities. Their sentences reflected that assessment, and that is why the issue of pardons matters. When Donald Trump publicly signaled support for mass pardons of January 6 defendants, Jack Smith explained why that raised serious concerns. In his view, releasing people who attacked police officers does not promote safety. It undermines it. Jack Smith noted that some of those individuals had already committed additional crimes after being released. This was not speculation. It was documented behavior. And he stated that any reasonable observer would expect more crimes to follow. The message was clear. Pardons are not symbolic when they involve violence. They have real-world consequences. And they send a signal about whether the rule of law still matters. At this point, Democratic members began placing something critical into the record: history. Congressman Jared Moskowitz read statements made by Republican leaders immediately after January 6th, statements that sharply contrasted with their current rhetoric. Jim Jordan had urged an end to violence and expressed support for Capitol Police. Ted Cruz had condemned the attack and affirmed that violence was unacceptable. Chip Roy had called the assault an attack on the Republic itself. Steve Scalise had credited Capitol Police with saving his life. Kevin McCarthy had stated unequivocally that Donald Trump bore responsibility and that those involved should be held accountable. These were not Democratic talking points. They were Republican statements made when the reality was impossible to deny. The contrast was striking because years later, many of the same figures were now minimizing the attack, reframing it, or deflecting blame entirely. The tension in the room intensified when MAGA Congressman Troy Nehls shifted focus toward the police officers themselves. Officers who had defended the Capitol on January 6th were present in the room. Instead of acknowledging their sacrifice, Nehls suggested that responsibility lay with Capitol leadership, not with Donald Trump, not with the attackers. The implication was clear and deeply offensive to those who had been injured in the line of duty. Officer Mike Fanone, who had suffered serious injuries during the attack, reacted visibly. The moment captured what many Americans felt, that the people who protected democracy were now being blamed for its assault. Jack Smith did not intervene emotionally. He did not argue politics. He stayed focused on the legal reality. Violence against police officers is not protected speech. It is not protest. It is a crime. As the discussion continued, the broader pattern became undeniable. MAGA Republicans were not interested in examining January 6th. They were interested in avoiding it, deflecting from it, reframing it as something it was not. But the record told a different story. Video, testimony, court rulings, and now their own past statements. Jack Smith's role was not to persuade emotionally, it was to document. And by the end of the segment, that documentation had grown heavier, more detailed, and far harder to dismiss. As Part 4 concluded, one truth stood firm. January 6 was not confusion. It was not chaos without cause. It was the result of deliberate actions and deliberate lies. And the people who suffered most were the ones who stood between violence and constitutional collapse. As the hearing moved deeper, MAGA Republicans shifted their strategy. The facts were no longer working for them, so they changed the subject. Instead of addressing the evidence, they began accusing Special Counsel Jack Smith of misconduct. The word they chose was explosive. Spying. Congressman Darrell Issa suggested that Jack Smith had secretly monitored members of Congress. He implied that subpoenas issued during the investigation were part of a covert surveillance effort. It was a serious accusation, and it was completely false. Jack Smith responded without raising his voice. He stated clearly that his office did not spy on anyone. No communications were intercepted. No conversations were recorded. No messages were read. As Issa pressed on, attempting to talk over the witness, the chairman was forced to restore order. The interruption itself became part of the moment, because it revealed how weak the accusation was. At this point, Congressman Dan Goldman, a former federal prosecutor, stepped in. And he did what prosecutors do. He explained the process. Goldman clarified that the records in question were toll records. Basic call logs. They show phone numbers, dates, times. They do not show content. They do not reveal what was said. They do not capture texts or emails. Goldman explained why those records mattered. The investigation had evidence that Donald Trump had directed Rudy Giuliani to contact members of Congress in the days surrounding January 6th. The purpose was to delay or disrupt the certification of the election. The toll records were requested for a narrow window, January 4 through January 7, not months, not years, days. This was not surveillance. It was documentation. A standard investigative step used to establish who contacted whom during an alleged conspiracy. Jack Smith confirmed this explanation. He stated that toll records are routinely used to corroborate testimony, to verify timelines, to understand how efforts were coordinated. This was not about politics. It was about evidence, and that distinction mattered. Congressman Jamie Raskin then addressed another claim repeatedly raised by MAGA Republicans, the idea that Donald Trump's conduct was protected by the First Amendment. Raskin framed the issue simply. Is there a First Amendment right to defraud the public? Is there a First Amendment right to obstruct an official proceeding? Is there a First Amendment right to conspire to overturn an election? Jack Smith's response was grounded in law. Speech used to facilitate a crime is not protected. Fraud requires speech. Conspiracies require communication. But the presence of speech does not erase criminal intent. Jack Smith noted that courts had already ruled on this issue. The argument had been raised. It had been rejected. The precedent was clear. The contrast was striking. While MAGA Republicans relied on slogans, Jack Smith and former prosecutors relied on case law. As this segment concluded, the spying narrative had collapsed, not because it was debated, but because it was explained. The hearing once again had produced the opposite result from what MAGA Republicans intended. Instead of discrediting the investigation, they had exposed their own lack of substance. And with every failed accusation, the focus returned to where it had started. Donald Trump. The evidence. And the law. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion, a final shift took place, one that revealed what MAGA Republicans were trying hardest to avoid. Congressman Ted Lieu addressed the room with a question that cut through the noise. What are Republicans so afraid of talking about? Lieu pointed out that instead of confronting Donald Trump's actions surrounding January 6 and classified documents, MAGA Republicans were desperate to change the subject. He argued that the attacks on Jack Smith were not about oversight, they were about distraction. Lieu accused Republicans of avoiding discussion of the Jeffrey Epstein files that remain largely sealed, files involving some of the most powerful people in America. According to Liu, Republicans would rather attack the prosecutor who charged Donald Trump than demand transparency about why so much information remains hidden. The implication was unmistakable. This hearing was not about accountability. It was about misdirection. As the final Democratic members used their time, the tone changed again. Less defensive, more reflective. Congressman Eric Swalwell addressed Jack Smith directly. He told him to have confidence in his work. Swalwell stated that Jack Smith had done exactly what the law required. No more, no less. He also addressed the January 6th officers who were present: Harry Dunn, Daniel Hodges, Sergeant Aquilino Gone, Mike Fanone. Swalwell stated that they had done everything right. They protected the Capitol. They upheld their oath. They stood between violence and constitutional collapse. He then turned his focus to MAGA Republicans. Swalwell accused them of performing outrage for cameras, while privately acknowledging the truth. He stated that many Republicans had openly criticized Donald Trump behind closed doors, but when the cameras turned on, they shrank. Swalwell called the hearing a performance, and Jack Smith, in his view, was simply the latest target. But performances end, records do not. As the final moments approached, the contrast was undeniable. On one side, anger, interruption, accusation. On the other, process, documentation, law. Jack Smith did not claim perfection. He did not claim victory. He did not argue politics. He did something far more lasting. He explained how accountability works. He explained that prosecutors do not choose cases based on popularity. They follow evidence. He explained that threats do not erase facts. He explained that power does not grant immunity. By the end of the hearing, one reality stood firm. This was not a failed prosecution. This was not a rogue investigation. This was the justice system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The hearing did not weaken the case against Donald Trump. It reinforced it. And as the room emptied, one truth lingered. History will not rely on shouting. History will rely on records, and the record created today will endure.